The betting book at White's was bound in calf and kept by the porter as though it held the secrets of the realm. And on the third evening of the season, Sebastian Vane, the Duke of Harrogate, set his glass on the polished mahogany and dipped a pen in it for the first time in 7 years. The men around the fire leaned in. A duke who did not wager was a duke with something to lose, and they had long suspected him of a heart, the way one suspects a locked room of a corpse. "Name your folly, Harrogate," said Lord Ackerley, who had lost 40 pounds to the fire's other side and wanted company in his ruin. Sebastian did not look up. He wrote in a hand so even it might have been printed, that he, the undersigned, would not marry within the 12-month, and would forfeit 1,000 pounds to any man who saw him wed before the next Michaelmas. He underlined the figure once. 1,000 pounds was a farm in Yorkshire, and the families on it. It was also, to him, a fortnight's rents, and he knew the difference, and was ashamed to know it. 1,000, Ackerley breathed. "You are certain of yourself." "I am certain of women," Sebastian said, and the table laughed because it was the safe and stupid thing to laugh at, and because none of them had ever watched him at a window deciding whether to be kind. A young viscount named Petersham, who had 3 sisters to settle and no fortune to settle them with, leaned across the green baize. "But surely, Harrogate, a man marries for an heir if for nothing else. Harrogate House wants a duchess. Your aunt grows old. There is a name to carry." "The name has carried itself for 400 years, Sebastian said. "It will manage another 40 without my dragging a stranger into it to be unhappy for the privilege." "I have watched the article called a good match, Petersham. I have stood up at the weddings. I have buried 2 of the brides. Marriage in this town is an auction held in a church, and I have never once seen the goods consulted." He set down his glass. "If I marry, it will be to a woman who would have me without the dukedom, and there is no such woman because there is no such circumstance in which she could ever meet me without it standing between us like a footman. So, the wager stands. 1,000 pounds, gentlemen, that no woman in England wants Sebastian Vane and not his coronet, and that I am wise enough to know the difference. It was the longest speech he had made at that fire in a decade, and it had the ring of a man arguing with someone who was not in the room. The porter, entering with fresh candles, marked it the way he marked everything and said nothing, and trimmed the wicks. There were 365 days written into that book. He had counted them himself, the pen still wet, and it pleased him to think of the number shrinking. A long road downhill to a year of peace, no mothers, no daughters arranged on settees like fruit. He blotted the ink, returned the pen, and went home to a house so large that his footsteps came back to him as company. Across the park, in a narrower house with a colder grate, Miss Honoria Lytton was reading aloud to a woman who did not listen. She had been reading aloud for 2 years, which is to say she had been a lady's companion for 2 years, which is to say she had been poor for considerably longer. Her father had been a clergyman with a good library and no living to leave it in. The books had gone to the bookseller, and Honoria had gone to Mrs. Penhallow of Bruton Street, who required a companion the way some require a fire screen, to sit between herself and the cold, and to be looked at no more than that. "You have stopped," Mrs. Penhallow observed. "I came to the end of the chapter, ma'am." "Did the soldier marry the governess?" "He did, ma'am, against the wishes of his family and the laws of probability." Mrs. Penhallow sniffed, which was as near to laughter as she came, and Honoria marked her place with a strip of ribbon and let the silence settle. She was 22. She had auburn hair that escaped its pins by evening no matter how she fought it, and a face her mother had once called pleasant, and her father had called clever, and the world had since settled on plain, because the world prefers a verdict it need not revise. She did not mind plain. She minded being read past, but she had a clergyman's training in patience and a clergyman's daughter's training in not showing it, and she folded both around herself like a shawl and waited for the candle to be worth the lighting. That night, in the narrow room under the eaves that Mrs. Penhallow gave her companion because no one else would sleep so near the chimney's cold side, Honoria did a thing she did every night, the way other women said their prayers, which, in fact, it was. She took from the bottom of her one small trunk a single book her father's creditors had let her keep, a worn duodecimo of George Herbert's verses, the binding soft as cloth from his thumbs. And from inside its backboard, where she had slit the paper and repasted it, she drew a small flat purse and counted what was in it. 11 pounds, 4 shillings, and 3 pence. It had been 12 pounds even 2 years ago, the whole of what his library had fetched at the bookseller's after the better volumes paid the apothecary, and the worse ones paid the grave. She spent it at the rate of a clergyman's daughter, which is to say she did not spend it, except when a winter cough or a worn-through sole forced her hand. And each shilling that left the purse left a mark on her she could not have explained to anyone who had never been one bad season from the river. She did not keep the money against a wedding, as the other companions kept theirs. She kept it against the day someone would offer her a thing she could not bear, so that she might have the wherewithal to say no. A poor woman who cannot say no is not poor, she had decided long ago. She is owned. The 11 pounds was the price of her own voice, and she guarded it as a duke guards a coronet. And for the same reason, it was the only thing she had that no one could take without her handing it over. She put the purse back inside Herbert's covers and read one poem by a candle end she was not strictly permitted, and slept. The wager would have stayed at White's, a private folly between idle men, had Lord Ackerley not been Mrs. Penhallow's nephew, and had he not, on the strength of 40 pounds lost and a great deal of brandy, told the story at his aunt's breakfast table the very next morning as though it were a victory of his own. 1,000 pounds, he said, buttering toast he would not eat. Harrogate swears off the whole sex for a year. The fellow's gone cold as his own marble. He was always cold, said Mrs. Penhallow, who collected the failings of dukes the way other women collected lace. He overpaid his footman's mother's apothecary when she took ill, Honoria said, before she had decided to say anything at all. Both heads turned. She had been pouring chocolate and had not meant to be a person at the table. And how, said Mrs. Penhallow, would a companion know the household accounts of a duke? The apothecary on Half Moon Street is my cousin's master, ma'am. He spoke of it. It seemed to me a cold man does not pay an old woman's reckoning and forbid his steward to mention it. Honoria set the pot down. But I'm only the one who reads the chapters. I'm sure his lordship knows the man better. Ackerley laughed, delighted, the way men laugh when a sparrow flies at a cat. Mrs. Penhallow did not laugh. She looked at her companion with the first genuine attention she had given her in 2 years, and something turned behind her eyes. Not warmth, never warmth, but calculation, which in Mrs. Penhallow was the warmer feeling. That was how Honoria Lytton came to be standing in the Duke of Harrogate's morning room a fortnight later, having been lent, there is no gentler word, she was a book Mrs. Penhallow had decided to circulate, to read 3 afternoons a week to the Duke's aunt, the Dowager Lady Vane, whose eyes had failed her and whose tongue had not. 348 days remained in the betting book the morning Honoria first climbed those steps. She did not know the number. She knew only that the door was very tall, and that she had darned the left thumb of her glove the night before, and the darn showed, and that she had decided not to be ashamed of it. The dowager was a small, fierce woman wrapped in more shawls than seemed structurally possible, planted in a chair by the fire like a relic in its reliquary. She turned her clouded eyes toward the sound of Honoria's curtsy and said, "You are the clergyman's girl Letty Penhallow is so proud to be rid of." "I am the clergyman's girl, my lady. Whether Mrs. Penhallow is proud I could not say. She does not confide in me." "No, people do not confide in the furniture." The dowager's mouth twitched. "Sit, read. And if you simper at me, I shall send you back in the same carriage that brought you." "I have never simpered in my life, my lady. I had no allowance for it." The old woman laughed, a dry sound like a door long shut. Honoria took up the book that lay ready on the small table at the dowager's elbow. And in lifting it, she saw the room properly for the first time, the way a poor person sees a rich room, which is to say, she saw what it cost and what it lacked at once. There was a chessboard set up on a marquetry table by the window, the pieces of carved ivory and ebony, mid-game, abandoned. White to move, and white in a losing position. A queen exposed that no one had troubled to save. The dust had settled into the squares. It had been mid-game for a long while. Above the mantel hung a portrait of a young man in the clothes of 30 years before, dark-eyed, unsmiling, with a jaw she would later learn to recognize. And on the table beside the dowager, where another woman might keep a work-basket, sat a child's miniature in a tarnished gold frame, face down, as though it had been turned from the light on purpose and left that way. "You are looking at my things," the dowager said, who could not see and did not need to. "Companions always do. They price a room before they sit in it. Tell me what you have priced." "A chessboard no one has finished, my lady, a portrait of a man who was angry at the painter or at himself. And a small frame turned to the wall, which is the most expensive thing in the room, because someone pays for it every day by not looking." There was a silence so complete that the fire's small voice filled it. "Letty Penhallow," said the dowager at last very softly, "has been keeping a hawk and feeding it on suet, and never once let it fly. Sit down, girl, read me something dull. I find I cannot be looked at so closely twice in one afternoon." And Honoria, taking up the book, did not see the Duke standing in the doorway behind her, arrested in the act of crossing his own hall by a sound he had not heard in that house in a great while. Sebastian had come to tell his aunt that he would dine out. He stayed because the new reader had a voice that did not perform, and because she read the dull, improving sermon his aunt favored as though she found it privately ridiculous and was too well bred to say so, which was precisely how he found it, and he had thought himself alone in the opinion. He did not announce himself. He watched the darn in her glove catch the light as she turned a page, and he thought, "There is a woman who mends her gloves and comes anyway." Then he was annoyed at himself for thinking anything at all, and he went out to dinner and lost at cards because he was not attending. 345 days remained. He told himself he attended his aunt's readings now out of duty. The dowager, who had buried a husband and 2 illusions, knew the look of a man lying to himself and said nothing, because she was enjoying it. She arranged for the fire to be poor, so that Honoria would have to lean toward the candle, and she asked for the longest sermons, and she pretended deafness so that the girl would have to repeat the dry things twice, the second time always a fraction drier, and the Duke would have to school his face. "You find Bishop Hartwell amusing, Miss Lytton?" Sebastian said one afternoon, when the dowager had at last slept, and the room was only the 2 of them and the small competent fire. "I find a great many things amusing, Your Grace. It is the cheapest of pleasures and the only one I have always been able to afford. He writes that humility is a woman's brightest ornament." "He does. He also kept 3 carriages and a cellar that wanted 2 men to lift the gout he died of." She closed the book. "I do not think the bishop and I would have understood one another. He admired humility the way a man admires a fine horse, from the saddle." Sebastian found he had crossed the room without deciding to. "And you do not admire humility?" "I have a great deal of it forced upon me, Your Grace. I'm not obliged to admire my circumstances as well. That would be greedy." She looked up at him then, level, neither bold nor cowed, and he saw that her eyes were not plain at all. The world had simply never bothered to light them properly. "You are standing very close to a companion, sir. People talk of less." "Let them." It was out before he weighed it. "They will, and it will cost you nothing and me my place." She stood, smoothing the plain sage muslin that had been turned twice and would not bear a third turning. "Forgive me. I forget myself. It is the only thing in this house I am encouraged to do." She curtsied and was gone before he found the words, and Sebastian Vane stood alone by a poor fire in a great house, and discovered that the wager he had written to keep women at a distance had not anticipated a woman who kept herself at one. It was the dowager who set them at the chessboard, the following week, by the simple expedient of refusing to be read to. "I am sick of bishops," she announced. "Honoria, there is a game by the window that my late husband and I left unfinished the winter he died, and no one has had the wit or the impertinence to move a piece since. It is white to play, and white is losing. Go and lose it properly, so I needn't look at it being lost slowly." "I cannot move your husband's game, my lady." "You can and you will. The dead do not collect their winnings." "Sebastian, you are loitering in that doorway again like a footman who has forgotten his message. Come and take black, since you are black-humored enough for it." So they sat, the Duke and the companion, over a board 30 years dusty, with the blind old woman by the fire instructing them both by memory of where the pieces had stood. And Honoria, considering the losing position she had inherited, did a reckless thing. She did not try to save the exposed queen. She gave it up. She pushed a single pawn instead, a small ignored thing 2 squares from where a queen would never deign to stand, and sat back. Sebastian frowned at the board. "You have left your queen to be taken." "I have." "Take her, your grace. She was lost the moment your father-in-law abandoned the game, my lady. There is no saving her. And a player who spends 3 moves trying only loses the pawns as well. So I shall let her go, and spend those 3 moves making that pawn into something. It is the only piece on the board that is not yet what it will be." She looked up at him. "A queen is only a queen. A pawn that crosses the whole board becomes whatever it likes." Sebastian took the queen. It was the correct move, and he hated making it. And 4 moves later, the small ignored pawn stood on the 8th rank, and Honoria, with great courtesy, asked the dowager which piece her ladyship would prefer it to become, since the choice by rights was hers. "A queen," said the old woman, and her clouded eyes were wet, and no one in the room remarked upon it, which is the truest kindness there is. "Make it a queen. He always let me win that way, the old fool. Let one back into the world." That night, at White's, Ackerley found him at the fire. "You're losing the bet, Harrogate," he said, half in jest. "You've a girl reading to your aunt 3 days a week, and you've moved your own card table to keep the hours." "My aunt is blind, Ackerley, not abandoned." "Your aunt has been blind 2 years, and you dined at home twice in all of it. Now you've not missed a Tuesday." Ackerley's grin was wide and witless and dangerous. "I've half a mind to put money on it. The companion, the little brown wren." Something in the Duke's stillness made the grin falter. "She mends her own gloves," Sebastian said quietly, "and reads your aunt's sermons better than the bishop wrote them, and you will not call her a wren in my hearing, or out of it." There were 326 days in the book. Ackerley looked at his friend's face and understood, with the slow horror of a man watching a fortune walk to the door, that he might yet collect his £1,000 and would not enjoy a penny of it. The Duke went home through a thin, cold rain, and on his own step found his second footman, a young man named Tom Hale, soaked to the bone and waiting where no servant should have been at that hour. "Your Grace, forgive me. My mother's took bad again, the chest. And the apothecary on Half Moon Street won't send the draft till the old reckoning's cleared, and I haven't got it till quarter day, and I durstn't ask Mr. Briggs the steward for an advance a second time." "How much is the reckoning?" £2.11, your Grace, with the new draft." Sebastian took out his purse there on the wet step under the dripping portico and counted £3 into the boy's red hands. "The reckoning, the draft, and a fire in your mother's room that does not go out before morning. And, Hale, you will not tell Briggs, because Briggs will enter it in a ledger, and a thing entered in a ledger becomes a debt, and this is not a debt." Do you understand me? A man does not lend his own people their mother's breath. Go on. You are letting the rain in. Tom Hale went and did not forget it, the way the poor do not forget the one rich man who treated their mother's life as worth more than its column in a book. And that, though neither of them could have known it on that wet step, was the whole hinge of everything that followed, for a kindness given without a ledger is the only kind that ever comes back. He went home, and, being the sort of man who could not hold a thought without spending it, Ackerley told his aunt everything. Mrs. Penhallow listened to her nephew the way a spider listens to a fly land. A duke who had not married in 7 years, who had wagered £1,000 against the very notion, and who could not keep from a poor companion's company. A companion who was, after all, Mrs. Penhallow's to lend or to recall. She did not see it as scheming. She would have been astonished to be called a villain. She was only a practical woman improving an asset. If Harrogate were softening toward the girl, then the girl was worth more in Bruton Street than in Harrogate House. And the thing to do with a rising market was to withdraw the goods and let the price climb. "Honoria," she said the next morning, "you will not go to Lady Vane's today." Honoria, who had laid out her one good feet-shoe the night before, kept her face still. "Is her ladyship unwell, ma'am?" "Her ladyship is no concern of yours. You have neglected your duties here. I find I cannot spare you." A pause, delicate as a dropped handkerchief. "Unless, of course, the position were to be made worth my inconvenience." And Honoria understood. She understood entirely, and the understanding sat in her chest like a swallowed coal. She was not a person in this house, and not a person in that one. She was a thing 2 households had begun to bid for, and the Duke, kind, dry, lonely Sebastian Vane, who had stood too close to a poor fire and let them talk. The Duke did not even know there was a price upon the afternoons he had thought were his. She thought of the betting book then, though she had never seen it. £1,000 that a man would not be moved, and a woman in Bruton Street quietly raising the stakes on the moving. "I understand you perfectly, ma'am," Honoria said. "I will attend to my duties." She did. She read 3 improving novels to Mrs. Penhallow that week in a voice with all the wit pressed out of it flat, and she did not go to Harrogate House, and she did not send word, because the word was not hers to send. At Harrogate House the fire on Tuesday was, for once, well built, and there was no one to lean toward it. Sebastian arrived at his aunt's room at the appointed hour out of a habit he had stopped pretending was duty. The chair by the candle was empty. The dowager sat with her ruined eyes fixed on the middle distance and her chin set at the angle she used for war. "She has not come," the old woman said. 3 days. No note. That girl would crawl here on her hands before she left a sermon half read out of rudeness. Someone has stopped her. "Aunt, do not aunt me, Sebastian. I am blind, not a fool, which is more than I can say for the men I am related to." She gripped the arms of her chair. "Whose creature is she? Who lent her to me?" "Mrs. Penhallow, of Bruton Street, Ackerley's aunt." The dowager was silent for a long moment. Then she laughed, the dry shut-door laugh, but there was no pleasure in it now. "Letty Penhallow? Of course. She has worked out what you have not, nephew. She has worked out what that girl is worth, and she means to be paid for it." The clouded eyes turned to him with terrible accuracy. "You have £1,000 riding on never feeling this, do you not? The whole of London knows it, so tell me, what is the wager worth to you now against 3 empty Tuesdays?" Sebastian stood in the middle of the room that had become, without his noticing, the only room he wished to be in. 291 days remained in the book at White's. He found, examining the figure, that it had stopped being a road downhill to peace. It had become a wall between himself and a darned glove. He did not go to Bruton Street to make an offer for a companion's hours. He understood, and the understanding was the first wholly decent thing his rank had ever taught him. That to bid for her against Mrs. Penhallow was to agree that she was a thing to be bid for. He would not put a price on her, because the entire cruelty of her life had been that everyone else already had. Instead, he sat down and wrote a letter, and addressed it not to Mrs. Penhallow, but to Miss Honoria Lytton, and sent it by a footman with orders to put it in her own hand, or bring it back. The footman, being the son of the woman whose apothecary's reckoning the Duke had quietly paid, contrived to put it in her own hand. She read it by the light of a candle she was not strictly permitted, in a room under the eaves, and the Duke had written nothing of wagers and nothing of money. He had written, "My aunt informs me that Bishop Hartwell remains unfinished, and that she will not have him read by anyone whose darns she cannot hear in their voice. She is, I am told, prepared to be unreasonable about this for a very long time. I find I am of her party. There is a position in this house that has never existed before, and exists now solely because the house has grown intolerable without it. That of the only person in it who tells me the truth. The wages are poor, the company is worse. I can promise you a fire that is properly built and a hearing for every dry word you care to spend. And I can promise that no one in this house will ever again read you past. Come, or do not. But know that the choice is yours, and that it is the first I have ever been able to give anyone, and I would not give it to another soul." 288 days remained. Honoria read the letter 4 times. Then she folded it and put on her one good fichu, and went down to Mrs. Penhallow, and did the bravest thing a poor woman can do, which is to make herself poorer on purpose. "I am giving you my notice, ma'am," she said. Mrs. Penhallow set down her chocolate very slowly. "You will have no character from me." "No, ma'am, I did not expect one. A reference is a kind of price, and I find I'm tired of being priced." Honoria's voice did not shake. She had practiced calm for 22 years, and it had finally come due. "You meant to sell my afternoons to the Duke. I would rather give them away than be the thing that passed between you. I do not know what waits for me, but I know what waits for me here, and I have read that chapter to its end." She walked out of Bruton Street with 1 box and a darned glove, and no character at all, into a season that ate poor women without a reference and spat the bones into the river. And she did it with her chin at exactly the angle the dowager used for war, because she had learned it from a blind woman in 3 short months, and it was the only inheritance she had. She did not go straight to Harrogate House. That was the part Sebastian had not foreseen, and the part that, when he heard it, undid him entirely. She took a room, a real room, paid from the £11 her father's last books had become, the small flat purse she had kept hidden in the covers of his Herbert for 2 years against exactly such a day. And the spending of it did not frighten her, because she had always known it was the price of one good no, and she had just bought the finest no of her life. She sent the Duke a note in her own clear hand. It said, "Your Grace, I have left Mrs. Penhallow's service of my own will and at my own cost, and I am no longer anyone's to lend. I will read to Lady Vane gladly as Honoria Lytton, who comes because she chooses to, and is paid an honest wage for honest hours, and goes home at the end of them to a room that is her own. I will not come as a position created to be kind to me, for that is only a gentler cage with a better fire. If those terms do not suit a duke, I shall understand. Dukes are not accustomed to women who name their own. But I have just discovered the luxury of choosing, and I find I cannot give it up so soon, even for you." Sebastian read it standing up, and then he had to sit down. He had offered her shelter, and she had handed it back. He had offered to lift her out of her circumstances, and she had told him, courteously, that she would rather climb. And he understood at last what his rank had spent 33 years hiding from him. That there is a kind of woman £1,000 cannot bet against, because she is not for sale at any figure, and that he had not fallen in love with the wren who needed rescuing. He had fallen in love with the one who had just declined to be. 279 days remained in the book. He found he did not care about a single one of them. The room she had taken was over a chandler's shop in a narrow, honest street. One window, a bed, a chair, and a small grate she fed herself and banked herself and answered to no one for. On her first night in it, she set Herbert's covers, emptied of their purse at last, the 11 pounds gone to the quarter's rent, and gladly, on the deep sill where the morning would reach them, and below the window she found, scratched into the soft plaster by some earlier tenant whose name was lost, 3 words. She lived here, not died, not lodged, not served. Lived. Honoria looked at the small defiant scratch a long while, and then she banked her own fire with her own coal in her own grate, and slept the sleep of a woman who had become, for the first time in 22 years, the verb in her own sentence. So Honoria came to read to the dowager as a free woman on an honest wage, 3 afternoons a week, and walked home each evening to her own door. And the arrangement was the most scandalously proper thing the Duke had ever been party to. He did not stand too close. He did not write her into a position. He sat across the well-built fire on the afternoons he could invent a reason to be home, which was all of them, and they argued about bishops. "You are courting me, Your Grace," she said one evening, in the tone she might use to observe that it had begun to rain. "I am attempting to. I am told I'm very bad at it." "You are terrible at it. You glower. A woman cannot tell whether you mean to propose or to foreclose on her." "I have never foreclosed on anyone in my life." "I know," she said, and the 2 dry words held more than any clinch because she did know. She had counted his quiet kindnesses the way other women counted compliments, and found them a richer coin. "It is the worst-kept secret in London, Your Grace, that you are a good man pretending to be a cold one. I cannot think why you bother. The pretense fools no one and exhausts you." He did not answer at once. Instead, he rose and went to the table where the small, tarnished frame had sat face down since before her time, and turned it over for the first time in years, and looked at it, and then, because she had earned the truth and he had run short of places to hide it, he brought it to her and laid it in her hands. A child of perhaps 4, fair, laughing, painted by someone who had loved the subject and not merely been paid for it. "My sister," he said. "Caroline. She married where the family forbade and was cut for it, by my father, and then, God forgive me, by me, because I was 22 and thought obedience was the same thing as honor. She wrote to me twice. I answered neither. She died of a fever in a parish I could have bought outright, 3 streets from a physician I could have sent, and the first I knew of it was a black-edged letter and a bill for the funeral, which I paid because that at least I knew how to do. The portrait is hers. My aunt keeps it turned to the wall so that I will not have to see it and will have to know it is there, which is the cruelest and kindest thing anyone has ever done for me." He looked at the fire. "I did not wager 1,000 pounds against women, Miss Lytton. I wagered it against being moved. The last time I was moved, I let it cost a life, and I found I would rather feel nothing at all than feel that again." The room was very quiet. Honoria did not tell him it was not his fault, because it partly was, and he would have known a comfortable lie for what it was, and trusted her less for it forever. She set the small frame upright on the table at her elbow, facing the room where it could be seen. "Then we will leave her looking outward," she said. "A thing turned to the wall is only a punishment. A thing one can bear to look at becomes a person one is allowed to have loved. You will not earn her back by refusing yourself the world she wanted you to have. Caroline married where her heart sent her and counted the cost cheap. I think she would be sorrier to watch her brother price himself out of every fire than to see him sit at one." She picked up the book again. "Now, shall I read, or shall you go on glowering?" I am paid for the one and not the other." He laughed, a startled, rusty sound, like the dowager's door-long-shut laugh, which he had got from her the way one gets a face, and sat and let her read, and the small frame watched them both, facing the room, and was never turned to the wall again. It was, the dowager remarked afterward to the empty air, the loudest thing she had ever heard in a quiet room. And she had heard a great deal in 80 years. The wager hung between them still, unspoken, for several Tuesdays more. It was Honoria who at last took it up, on an evening when the fire was good and the dowager genuinely asleep. "There is a wager. You will not speak of it, so I shall." She closed the book on her finger. "You will have heard of it yourself, Your Grace, since you wrote it." "All London has heard of it. £1,000 that the Duke of Harrogate will not marry within the year. It is the only reason half the mothers in town have stopped throwing their daughters at you. You have made yourself unwinnable, and there is no sport in an unwinnable hand." She tilted her head. "How many days remain?" 261, he said, because he had counted that morning, and the number that had once been a comfort now sounded like a sentence read aloud. "And if you marry, you forfeit £1,000 to a roomful of men who will dine on the story for a decade." £1,000. He turned his glass in his hand. "Do you know, when I wrote the figure I thought of a particular place, a tenant farm in Yorkshire on the north edge of my land, 9 families on it, that £1,000 would carry through a bad year or break in a worse one. I thought of it because it was the only way I had of feeling the sum at all. To the men at that fire, it is an evening's loss. To those 9 families, it is the difference between staying and the workhouse. I have always known that, and never once done anything about it, because a man does not give away money he has wagered without losing face. And I have spent 33 years guarding a face that has brought me nothing but quiet." He looked up. "I would forfeit considerably more than £1,000, and consider it the cheapest bargain I ever struck. But I will not ask you while there is a wager standing, Honoria. I will not have it said ever by anyone, in any year, that you were a thing I won or a thing I lost. You have spent your whole life being the stake in other people's games. You will not be mine." It was, she thought, the single most romantic thing a man had ever failed to say to her. And she understood. This was the part she had not foreseen, and the part that undid her. That he meant to give up the asking itself, the thing he wanted most, rather than let her be wagered upon one final time. So she took the matter, as she had taken every matter of her life, into her own darned hands. She went to White's. A woman could not enter White's, this is well known, and Honoria knew it better than most, having spent her life on the wrong side of doors. So she did not go in. She went to the porter at the step, the keeper of the calf-bound book, and she gave him a folded paper and a coin she could not spare, and asked that it be entered in the betting book in her own words, beneath the Duke's wager, and read aloud at the fire that night. The porter, who had kept that book through 3 reigns and seen earls ruined and heirs born of its pages, looked at the plain young woman with the darned glove and the chin held like a blade, and did a thing he had not done in 40 years of service. He read what she had written. And then he said, "It will be entered, miss, and read at the fire, and I'll read it myself, for I've a feeling about it." And he would take only half the coin. That night, Lord Ackerley sat at the fire at White's, 260 days into a wager he had begun to hope he would lose. And the porter came in with the calf-bound book and read, in the carrying voice of a man who has waited 40 years for one good entry, the wager written beneath the Duke's in a clergyman's daughter's even hand, that she, the undersigned being Honoria Lytton, of no fortune and no character and entirely her own, did wager the said Duke of Harrogate £1,000 that he would propose marriage to her within the fortnight. And that should she win, she would require him to pay the forfeit not to the gentlemen of this club, but to the families on the Yorkshire farm £1,000 would have ruined or saved, and that should she lose, she would consider it the best money she had never had, spent to learn the worth of a man at last. The fire was very quiet. Then Lord Ackerley, who was witless and warm, and not, it turned out, a villain at all, stood up and roared with laughter and called for a pen, and entered his own £40 on the side of the companion. And by the time the candles burned low, every man at the fire had wagered against the Duke and for the Wren, and the betting book of White's held the most popular hand in its long history, and not one man in the room wished to win it. Sebastian heard of it the next morning from his valet, who heard it from the footman, who heard it from the porter, who told everyone, because a man waits 40 years for an entry like that and does not keep it to himself. He found her at the Dowager's fire, reading Bishop Hartwell on the brightest ornament of a woman, and he stood in the doorway exactly as he had the first day, arrested by the sound of her. "You wagered against me," he said. "I wagered on you," she corrected, without looking up. "There is a difference, Your Grace, and you of all men should mark it. You wagered that you could not be moved. I wagered that you already had been, and were only too proud and too kind to say so while the asking might cost me my dignity. One of us has read the other correctly. I am afraid it is not you." He crossed the room. He did not glower. The Dowager, who was not asleep at all and had never in her life been asleep when something interesting was happening, kept her clouded eyes shut and her dry mouth firmly closed. "You have made it so that I cannot propose to win you," Sebastian said, "and cannot stay silent without losing you a wager, and cannot pay the forfeit anywhere but to a farm full of strangers in Yorkshire. You have arranged it, Miss Lytton, so that there is no version of this in which you are the prize." "Yes," she said. "I have read a great many novels in which the woman is the prize. I did not care for the endings. The prize never gets to choose." At last she set down the book and looked up at him, and her plainness in that moment was the most beautiful thing in the warm room, because it was lit at last by someone who had bothered. "So, there are 11 days left on my wager and 259 on yours, and I have arranged matters so that you may marry me without winning me. The only thing I have left undone, Your Grace, is the part that was always yours to do." Sebastian Vane, the cold Duke of Harrogate, who had not knelt to anyone in his life because his rank had never required it of him, went down on one knee on the worn hearthrug before a clergyman's penniless daughter, and took her darned glove in both his hands, and found he could not for a moment speak, because the asking was the first thing he had ever wanted that he could not buy and would not win. "Honoria Lytton, of no fortune and no character and entirely your own," he said when he had command of himself, "will you win your wager and marry me? Not because I have moved you, though God knows I have tried, but because you choose to, the way you chose to leave Bruton Street with one box and no reference and more dignity than the whole of the peerage owns between them? I can promise you a fire that is properly built. I can promise that no one in any house of mine will ever again read you past, and I can promise that both £1,000, yours that I have lost and mine that I have lost, will go exactly where you said, to the 9 families and not to that fire, and that I will consider it the cheapest and the only honest wager I ever made." "You will lose your own, you know," she said softly. "You will be the man who swore off the whole sex and married a companion inside the year. They will laugh at you at the fire for a decade. They are already laughing. They wagered against me to a man." He smiled then, the rare real smile she had spent 3 months earning. "I find I would rather be laughed at beside you than envied alone. It is a poor wager that only protects you from being touched." So she won her wager and he lost his, which by the plain arithmetic of the betting book came to £2,000 out of one duke's pocket. 1,000 forfeit for marrying within the year, and 1,000 more forfeit because she had wagered he would propose, and he had gone and proved her right. He paid every penny of it, both thousands together, to the 9 families on the north edge of his Yorkshire land, who never learned the name of the bet that saved them, only that the Duke's man came at quarter day with the rents forgiven and the roofs to be mended before winter. It was the most a man ever lost at White's, and the only fortune that table ever produced that left two people richer than it found them. They were wed quietly before Michaelmas, in a small church with a good library that Honoria had asked for because it reminded her of her father's, and the Duke had bought the living of it that same week and given it to a curate who had been waiting 9 years for one, so that the church would have a clergyman who knew what it was to wait. The Dowager Lady Vane sat in the front pew refusing to weep and weeping. Lord Ackerley stood up for the Duke and cried openly into a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth, and afterward shook the bride's hand and said, "Madam, I lost 40 pounds the night this all began, and I've just won it back 6 times over watching it end, and I would not have traded the loss for the world." The porter from White's was there, seated near the front in his Sunday black, because the Duke had said a man who reads the right entry at the right fire is worth more than half the peerage, and meant it. Tom Hale stood at the back with his mother on his arm, the mother whose breath a Duke had once bought on a wet step for 3 pounds and no ledger, and when the new Duchess passed, she stopped and took the old woman's hand, and said only, "I am told you are why," which neither of them fully understood, and both of them somehow did. The calf-bound book was left behind on its lectern at White's for once, because the only entry that mattered had already been read, and a betting book has no business at a wedding. The Dowager gave the bride a single gift, the darned glove, cleaned and pressed and framed in a small case of warm wood, with a card in a servant's careful hand, for she could no longer write herself. It read, "You mended this and came anyway. I have lived 80 years and met 3 people worth the trouble. Mind you light the 4th one properly. Honoria hung it where the morning sun would reach it. And on the days when the great house felt too large, she would stand before it and remember that she had walked out of Bruton Street with this glove and her chin and not one thing else, and had still, somehow, chosen everything that came after. In the years that followed, there were Tuesdays without number and a fire always properly built, and a Duke who had stopped pretending to be cold because the woman across the hearth had read the secret aloud and the house had not fallen. They argued about bishops until the Dowager's death, and afterward kept arguing for her sake, because she had liked it so. And once a year, on the night the old wager would have come due, Sebastian would take down the calf-bound book the porter had at last bequeathed him, and read aloud at his own fire the entry in his wife's even hand. The wager of a woman of no fortune and no character and entirely her own. And Honoria would let him reach the end before she observed, in the tone she might use to note that it had begun to rain, that he was still terrible at reading aloud, and always had been, and that it was the dearest of all the many things she had chosen. The framed glove hung where the morning light reached it, beside 3 words a stranger had once scratched into plaster in a narrow rented room, and that Honoria had carried with her, copied in her own even hand onto a card and tucked into the case alongside the Dowager's. She lived here. She had it placed so that any companion, any reader, any plain woman lent and recalled and read past whoever came through the great house's doors would see it on the wall and understand that in this house, at least, a poor woman's no was worth a Duke's whole fortune, and her yes worth a great deal more than that. There was nowhere either of them had to be. The candle was worth the lighting, and the only sums that had ever mattered between them had long since been spent on the right people, in the right county, for the only honest reason in the world, which was that 2 people had stopped letting themselves be wagered and had begun at last to choose.